This video is an interview I did with Jeanne Dukerschein, who is a natural dyer, and at the end there's a little clip that she gave me of her doing some natural dyeing, so I hope you enjoy it.
Hi everybody, I'm here with Jeanne Dukerschein, and I invited her onto the channel because she's doing a lot of really interesting things with natural dyes. And I get a lot of questions from people about how well does the fine Shetland wool take to dyeing. And so I thought I'd bring on Jeanne to kind of talk us through some of her experiences and techniques that she's using as a very experienced dyer, particularly natural dyes. So welcome, Jeanne. Thanks for being on the show.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I'm enjoying this.
Good. So I guess what I'd like to start with is if you could just tell us your origin story, how you got into the sheep and, you know, just kind of how it all started.
It all started when my mother bought an antique Wells double drive single treadle Wells wheel before I was born, and had it in the house when we were growing up, and nobody knew how to spin on it, but we played with it a lot and got familiar with it. It was a working wheel with all the bands and everything in place. So when I always had wanted to spin but could never find a teacher, and that's a lot of people were like that back then. And so about when I was in my 40s sometime, my son was out of college and had his first job in Texas, and we went down on the plane from Minneapolis to see him, and there was a woman knitting a few rows ahead of me, and the stewardess came along and said, and I was knitting too, and she said, "What are you knitting?" And the minute the other woman heard knitting, her head whips around and looks at me, you know, and then she said, let's try and switch seats so we can sit together and knit together on the whole flight, you know. And then we started talking about, I found out Renee hand spun most of her yarn, and I was fascinated. I said, "Where did you learn and where can I learn? I live, you know, 2.5 hours south of you. Do you know anyone in this area who knows how to spin that I could learn from?" And she said, yes. And she also said Shetland sheep would be a really good sheep to start with because their wool is premier hand spinning wool and it's easy to spin. And this woman happens to have Shetland sheep too, and she gave me the name. It took me about a year to find Nancy. And finally, when I found her, we got together and had a lot of fun, and I ended up buying our first flock of sheep from her too. So and one of them, Godiva, turned out to be fine fleece. That's what I knew I wanted. And so I was looking to find the finest one she had. And we brought them up here to our farm when we retired in northern Wisconsin. And so now we raise and breed Shetland sheep, and we have the wool. And I spin, knit, crochet, once in a while weave, but not very often. And felt. I felt quite a bit. So the fine Shetland felts quite well relative to the coarser Shetlands, and the undercoats of the double coated felt well too, but they're hard to separate out. So.
Yeah, I've gotten that feedback from a customer that bought a fleece from me, who was a very passionate felter, and she was really happy with the results. She kind of wrote a really long piece about it on Ravelry and stuff. But so yeah, so for the fine fleece Shetland, so you're breeding now for fine fleece Shetlands. You're part of the
same as you are, right?
Yep. So can you talk a little bit about the fine wool, dyeing the fine wool, and what special considerations or techniques you have to use with dyeing?
Even fine Shetlands, you know, have a gradation of how fine the wool is based on the body part, and the finest is the neck. And on the necks, I am a little more careful with, I try to use weaker concentrations of, you know, dye or the chemicals that go with it. The chemicals that go with it, usually with natural dyeing, they're not that harsh, but there are a few like ammonia where you're changing the pH. If you change it too much, it might be a little more fragile on the neck wool, but I haven't really had any trouble. It takes color well. There's many interesting colors to over dye that create very interesting results, both with natural and commercial acid dyes. So I think it dyes well. And of course, different animals dye differently among sheep, but also goats. Mohair dyes differently, and so
what's the failure mode if your chemicals cause issues, like how is it what is it, how does it manifest
well,
itself?
they can, it's kind of dull and brittle and may become tender, may break more easily after it's dyed, so that when you're knitting, the yarn won't be as strong and the texture won't be quite as, it'll be dull and a little bit rougher, harsher feeling. It's like when a person over bleaches their hair.
Okay, all right.
Really similar to that, or if you've been in the swimming pool all summer and your hair turns green, it's kind of like that. Okay. So you can tell pretty fast. I mean,
Okay.
and I have had really not much of that. It was only when I was first starting usually. And so now I'm pretty careful. And the other failure mode is because fine Shetland felt's easier than regular, many other wools, it can felt if you change temperature fast while you're dyeing. So you have to be careful about that. Not as careful as with a fiber like alpaca that felts really easily, but somewhat careful.
I see. Okay. All right, very helpful. All right, so can you talk a little bit, you got into it somewhat, the natural colors of the Shetland wool and how those play with dyes and some of your experiments and things you
Okay. Many of the patterned Shetlands are what they call a goodie, that there's a fading effect on the main blanket fleece of the body, and they may have colored points like a Siamese cat. And I love those agouti, those lighter blankets on the sheep, because they over dye very well. They'll have a little bit of undercolor that makes the colors softer, but they'll really show the colors well because they're fairly light fleeces. And the morit, the browns, any brown like a fawn is a variation of morit that's a little grayer. And then the morit is the regular red brown or golden brown. Those over dye fantastically because, and they actually change the color. Like if you dye a brown with a lighter golden brown with a regular bright green, it turns into forest green on the brown, over the brown, and red turns, bright red like tomato red turns into burgundy. And those are acid dyes that I mainly, commercial dyes I experimented with to see that, but it makes really beautiful colors. And it's kind of a surprise. It's kind of fun, So.
Yeah.
And then the whites, of course, if you want really clear colors, you use a really clear white. And there are more creamy whites, like a goody muscat Shetland. That will be a creamy white as an adult, but it's a very light brown as a lamb. So it changes over the time, over its lifespan, and it creates different results. Yeah.
You were saying that it kind of looks like a mushroom?
Yeah, and this is a little bit of a felted, cruelty-free pelt. That's kind of the color. That's probably a 2-year-old, I would say, or a 3-year-old, and it's darker on the back because that was from a lamb. So it changes color as it grows up and becomes this color pretty much. It's got a little gray in it, and it's got a little brown in it, and it's creamy. So that's how a muscat looks, and they really over dye nicely because they warm up the colors a little bit. And its black-based counterpart is an agouti gray, and we just call it a gray or an agouti gray, and it doesn't have a special name like muscat. And they cool down the colors when you over dye, and they're fun to use too, especially with blues and greens. So.
And you were saying that you don't get to play with gray as much because your fleeces sell so rapidly.
Yeah, the gray fleeces, and also the breeding rams and the ewes sell really fast too because people love them. They're pretty cheap.
Yeah.
Gray fleeces.
I'm very partial to gray myself, so.
Yeah.
So one of the things that kind of gave me the inspiration for having this conversation and recording it was I was following you. I follow you on Instagram, and your Instagram feed, you really share a lot of images of, experimenting with the dyes, and it's mostly natural dye. So it seems like you're more of a natural focus. And it's just really fun to watch. Like, the thing that kills me about it is it seems like many times you're not really sure what you're going to get. So, so I just wondered if you could talk about that and just kind of what your attitude has to be going in and,
Well, that's the fun part. I have some really good books that have excellent directions that are very clear. And if I use those, it's more predictable. And I usually do use them, but sometimes I'll modify it to play. And if you go into it with I usually go into natural dyeing with a fairly playful attitude because sometimes it just, oh wow, it exceeds your expectations, and other times it's kind of like, oh, how did this happen? So and then you have to go back and figure out what you did wrong, or maybe your concentration of wool relative to water and relative to dye stuff wasn't correct. Usually that's what it is the dye is too weak because you had too much water or too much wool, but there can be other things too. It's a little hard to predict when you're using a new plant. So I mean, black-eyed Susan looked like it would produce a really nice green, and all I got was this really blah, hardly there, grayish brownish color, and it was a lot of work, and I hated it. And I said, I'm never using black-eyed Susan again, which I probably should try again. It probably wasn't concentrated enough or boiled long enough. Sunflowers and black-eyed Susans, you have to boil a long time or simmer a long time before you even put the wool in to extract the dye from the plant. So various plants will differ quite a bit.
What color were you expecting with the black-eyed Susan?
I wanted a dark green, like an olive green, a dark olive green, and sunflowers will make the same color. I don't know if it's the same dye. Sunflowers are a little easier, but you have to mordant those with copper, and I don't like to use toxic mordants. I usually just use alum because I know I can pour it out and it'll be fine and it won't hurt my septic tank or my soil or anything. So copper sulfate is more toxic, especially for sheep. They get too much in their grass, or something. So I usually just boil copper plumbing pipe with it during the dyeing process with a little extra acid, and that will do a little bit of a greenish cast, but it doesn't do too much. So it's not the nice dark olive green. So I'm still working on that one. The greens are kind of challenging. So
wow.
Usually I blend colors to get greens more so.
Do you have a dye garden?
I do, yeah. I scatter it around different places, and I have a great big garden for vegetables, and I tuck in the dye plants, and then I have big tractor tires that I grow my Japanese indigo in, because some of the dye plants are a little invasive, and you want to keep them kind of contained, and those tractor tires are like raised beds, and it doesn't spread much from there. So so I probably will put it in the garden though some year, because I need more for the dry leaf fermentation, the traditional Tsukumo Japanese fermentation vats. You need a lot of leaves for that. So
So you have some stuff behind you there. I wondered if you could do a little show and tell.
Yeah, sure. Where do you want me to start? Well, we were talking about indigo. You can also do some really simple things with indigo leaves. You can pound prints onto fabric, and it's a permanent dye. You don't need a mordant. So this is a white bandana that I dyed with avocado to kind of tone down the white, and then I pounded a bunch of indigo leaves this morning. If you pick them first thing in the morning, they make more color. I think that has something to do with the plant being overnight resting or something and storing some things that are needed for the color. And you can do all kinds of, like little birds on a face mask or little butterflies. You can do fun things with it, or big rosettes of radiating leaves. It's really fun. And it's simple. I've done it with kids in workshops with other flowers, not with indigo, because I haven't done it at the right time of year for that. But I have plants indoors now that I saved in my greenhouse and dug from the outdoor bed, So I can do this anytime. Yep, that's Japanese indigo. And I'm making some seeds on it too. I don't know if they're kind of small, but I raised the seeds because it's hard to find the seeds. They only last a couple of years. I refrigerate them. If I refrigerate them, they last 2 years, but some people only get 1 year and then they go bad, so.
Isn't indigo perennial?
No, it's an annual, because we live in northern Wisconsin. In Japan, I think even they plant it as an annual and just harvest it. So, but it's related to the smartweeds, and they kind of just come up on their own every year, and it would too if we let it go. It's frost tender, but there's so many seeds that some of them survive and come up at the right time. So,
Neat.
Yeah.
All right. What else you got back there?
Okay, I did a lot of coreopsis this year, and I love this coreopsis one. This is the orange that you can get if you have a strong dye bath and boil it quite a long time and make it fairly concentrated. And then this is compared to the dark indigo you can get. So I love those two colors together because they're complementary. Yeah. And then Coreopsis in weaker dye baths makes more of a gold. Like I have some locks here that are both gold and orange, so you can see the difference. Like at the beginning of the season, the plants are younger and they haven't made so much dye. And when you get impatient and pick the flowers, then and you don't have as many flowers, you know, because it's early in the season, you get this pretty light gold yellow. And then later on, you start getting these oranges when you include the seeds and the flowers and everything. So
that is so cool.
Yeah, it's fun. And then sometimes I'll do like 2 different marigold and coreopsis, and at the end I'll have these exhausts that I throw together and just make assorted yellows from them, you know, because they'll dye together too.
What
An
does exhaust
exhaust is like after you do the very first original dye bath, there's still some color left in it, and you put yarn in and you get lighter colors then. But if you mix them together, you get an interesting little mix of both colors. And I do that also with indigo. Has Japanese indigo, when you boil it, first you extract the blue, the indocin, and then you extract the yellow with higher heat. So it's a 2-step plant. It gives you 2 different colors. It gives you both blue in the first step and yellow in the second step. So that's a really nice plant to grow because you get 2 colors for one plant.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So can you talk about the what kind of wool you like to dye with? You know, are you dyeing mill spun yarn? Are you dyeing roving? You know, raw?
The form of the wool. The easiest ones to use that prevent felting more are the locks and the mill spun or hand spun yarn. In the intermediate stages, when it's carded, it felts a little more easily. You can do it, but you have to be more careful. You know, it's
and
like
alpaca.
Huh?
You wash the locks before?
Oh yeah, you have to wash all my wool that I wash here. I do at least 2 washes with a pH neutral detergent, and then I soak it in a professional Dyers or fabric detergent that I get from Dharma Trading Company right before, because even just to be sure all the oils are out, it creates more of an even dye. And I actually leave the detergent right in the yarn when I dye it, and then I rinse well afterwards. So you're in effect kind of giving the yarn a weak wash at the end too, all in one step, because it still has some detergent in the dye pot. So that works pretty well for me.
I imagine you've experimented with different things before you landed.
Because you have to be careful with the detergent. If it's not pH neutral, it might change the color. So, I mean, you know that from washing wool, it affects the wool in lots of different ways. So, I know you're careful too.
Yeah, I'll put a link on maybe you can share with me the name of the Dharma detergent that you use that we can.
Oh, sure.
For people.
Yeah, it's their house brand and it's a little less expensive. Synthropol is the professional name of the other brand. It's not their house brand. Both of them are practically the same thing, but I just buy the house brand.
Okay. So let's talk about your background as a scientist. And I guess I just want to hear you talk a little bit about how you approach dyeing, or how that's informed this hobby of yours. And, you know, as you're talking with other dyers, you know, you got kind of a unique perspective, I guess.
Yeah, when I came through college, I had to have almost a major in chemistry to do the medical laboratory, the medical technologist degree. So I learned we have a lot of color reactions in medical technology when we're diagnosing or determining blood concentrations in people with various substances that can be in the blood, and a lot of color reactions, and the endpoints have to be pretty sensitive because you're working with this tiny amount of material in the blood, and then you have to have a range within the color so that you can actually make a graph and determine a calibration graph and determine what the concentration is. So basically I learned that big, sensitive dyes, color changes can occur pretty fast at very small concentrations with the right range and the right chemical. And that's what they're using when they use all this natural dyeing stuff. You have to kind of find arranged to work in, and if you follow directions in books, that helps a lot because they've already done all that work.
Yeah.
My two favorite books are Dyer's Garden by Rita Buchanan. That one's actually out of print right now, and it's hard to find, but it's really a good, it's just a little book, and it's really, really good, well written, clear directions. She talks about the unpredictability. She's very honest about it. The hardness of your water affects it too, and the amount of iron in the water. And my other one is a new book, Soulful Dying for All Eternity, Singing the Blues. Who wouldn't want to buy a book with that title? It's kind of pricey, but I asked for it for Christmas. And it's by John Marshall, and he has actually spent many years in Japan with the world famous Japanese indigo artists doing all kinds of different work. But he goes through almost every technique you can use with indigo, except for the yellow form. He doesn't, that's called the white indigo. He doesn't, or the, not the, no, that's different. I'm sorry. The yellow form that you boil. He doesn't talk much about that, but see, he makes these very intricate leaf prints. I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah.
But yeah, and big ones, that are just gorgeous. And so I'm just doing baby steps here, but he's a real artist. So,
Something. Wow.
and he's also very good on his technical information. He does a remarkable combination of both. So it's worth the money. It's about $50, but it's worth the money. And then if you dye a lot with indigo anyway, it is, but even as a book, it's fun to read. So
Yeah.
And then I've got avocado. This shirt here that I'm wearing, I'm going to make into an all-season shirt. That's one of our principles in Fiber Shed, is that we wear our clothes as long and as much as we can before we buy new ones. And we use, this is not, I don't know if this is a sustainable fiber, but some fibers are just more sustainable to produce than others are. And there's ways to do it and ways not to do it. And cotton's pretty bad actually, but unless you grow organic cotton. But this is my wool from a Muscat Shetland over dyed with Haas avocado dye, I think. And the first bath is pinker. These are just, what do you call them, Rologs that I did on hand carders. And I want a nice fluffy wool, and I'm going to use that because it has some of these colors here in this shirt. And then I'm going to pull more brown Shetland and gray Shetland and just make a cowl that works with this, and then make some fingerless gauntlets, that come up so I can winterize it, kind of wear it more seasonally.
So that's so cool. Yeah. So for that, the avocado dyed wool, you dyed those locks and then you carded it into Rolex, or
that's what I do. Yeah, and then I actually took some of it through hand spinning when I was first doing it. I hand spun these, and these are not as brilliant in color because I was just learning and I hadn't found my concentrations yet. For this really pink one, this is the first bath, so it's the darkest bath. The dye solution was red because Haas avocados, they're the ones that have the reddish skins, and you use the pits and the skins and everything. And I collected them all winter long, and I boiled them once a week because that's how you extract the color every time you put a new one in. So I tried to eat an avocado at least once a week because if you let go too long, it gets moldy. So I just kept it going all winter and made a really concentrated extract and strained it, and then I froze it, and it sat in my freezer for about 3 years before I finally got to it. And this fall, we were cleaning the freezer, and Russ said either it gets thrown away or you do something with it. So I just did it, And
I'm so glad you did. It's so pretty.
I'm glad I did it too. Because it can get quite beige like this. Sometimes if you overheat it, it turns brown. But it also, this is more of my water is kind of acidic here, so I have to use an alkaline diff to get those really pink pinks and stuff. So, yeah. So
there's so much to consider.
It took a long time to figure out avocados, but they're pretty nice when you do. Yeah, there's a lot.
Boy, oh boy. It's like the thing you say, I come up with 20 more questions to ask you about it. There's so much there to learn. It's just amazing.
And I learned my avocado dyeing from a young lady who was only 17 years old. She was homeschooled and she was very, very artistic. She still is, I'm sure. She has an Etsy store and a website. But that was down in southeast Minnesota, so I haven't talked to her for a while. But she was a wonderful young lady. She gave me the seeds and she gave me the directions. And now there's stuff out on the web too. So her name's Hannah, and I can't remember. She's probably married, so her last name's probably not the same now anyway. But
Oh, that's so great.
everybody shares, yeah. And the ladies in Fiber Shed, there's a Fiber Shed movement across the country, like a watershed, only it's for fiber, and it's
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. Yeah.
yeah, sustainable, organic, regenerative farming methods, and only natural dyeing is allowed for the product, and then the fiber is grown on the farm, of course, and you're marketing it locally, so you're not requiring a lot of shipping, extra fuel and stuff like that. So anyway, that they're springing up all over the country. Usually the radius is about 175 to 200 miles. So you could be 400 miles. It depends on the number of producers in the area. With more producers, they concentrate down, and there's smaller in geography, but excuse me, ours is 175 miles from the Twin Cities, so I qualify for it. And the only reason I'm not a formal member, I've been affiliated for many years and I'm friends with many of the people, but they don't allow you to use any commercial acid dyes, and I kind of like those once in a while. So
Yeah.
yeah, we try to be sustainable, but with everything
Do you
else.
have to be certified organic?
You just have to be willing to learn and to use it. And I've never actually applied to see. I am not certified organic here, but we use a lot of organic methods. They give you a questionnaire at the beginning. So the reason I'm not is because we have to use herbicides under the electric fences and a few other places, but I don't use any pesticides or any of that. So
well, gee, this was just amazing. I appreciate you so much taking the time to share your knowledge and experience, and you know, using dyes with the Soft Shetland wool. That's really, really interesting. So just thanks. And we are going to put a bunch of links. You have a lot more information you want to share, right? So we'll link that up in the notes. And then I will ask you, I'll show you how to do this, but I may get some comments and questions from some of my viewers and subscribers. And maybe if you can offer to answer any questions anybody might have in the comments later on, you'd be more than happy.
Sure. Okay. Is there a way to link it up to email or any of that where I would see that somebody has a question so I could go check, or is there a way
to alert you? Yeah.
Okay. That would be good. Yeah.
Well, thank you again. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. It was fun. Reduce the blue to yellow. But when the oxygen hits it, now that the dye is all soaked inside the yarn rather than on the outside, when the oxygen hits it, it turns blue once it's drained. You see how it's turning? It's really fun to do this. And I'm getting a nice blue here. As it gets more oxygen, it will get bluer and bluer. But I'm wanting to let it drain as slowly as possible so that as much dye as possible goes into the wool. And then I'm going to take it over and drain it some more.